This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of A Distant Neighborhood, Complete Edition, and Attack on Titan Anthology. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys who love to talk about manga. And on the November episode of the series, Shea and I are going to be talking about two recent publications. We're going to begin with Jiro Taniguchi's A Distant Neighborhood, the Complete Edition. And then after that, we're going to look at Attack on Titan Anthology by a variety of different creators. But before we get into those conversations, we want to let all of you listening know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But many times, you can find discounts that go higher than that.
For example, in the month of November, you listeners can pick up the deluxe editions of Ai Yazawa's Paradise Kiss for 25% off. And volumes of Bakuman, which we have mentioned on the show before, for 30% off.
That's right. You get great discounts on comics, manga, and whatever else may suit your fancy that you can find on Discount Comic Book Service. You got to check out their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the manga guys, Shea and Derek, sent you. So, Shea, we are recording this right on the other side of Thanksgiving. So how was your holiday?
Yeah, like I was telling you before we started recording, I was actually not able to be on the annual Thanksgiving episode like a bunch of other hosts and co-hosts of different Comics Alternative podcast episodes, because I was having to wrangle, I was dog sitting for my parents, and then we were dog sitting for Nicole, my fiance's parents as well. And then we had just gotten a new puppy, a mini dachshund, who was waking up in the middle of the night and keeping us up. So we were dealing with a puppy and then two dogs, one in, on complete opposite sides of town. So we were running around all everywhere. And so my Thanksgiving was a little hectic, but we managed to stay sane. What about you? Was your Thanksgiving a little more relaxing than mine?
Yeah, mine was apparently a lot more relaxing than yours was. We didn't have to deal with a lot of different dogs and run a variety of different errands. But basically our Thanksgiving around the Royal Siegfried household was just sitting around, cooking, eating, and not necessarily in that order.
Yeah, that sounds like an ideal Thanksgiving.
Yes, and of course, watching the annual Mystery Science Theater 3000 Turkey Day special. So, which of course used to be back in the 1990s on either Comedy Central or Sci-Fi Channel, but over the past several years they've done it through what is it? What is it, that company? The Shout Factory. Yeah, Shout Factory, or through their YouTube channel where they do the live streaming. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. I don't know too much about Mystery Science Theater. I didn't realize they do an annual Thanksgiving event.
Oh, yes. It would not be Thanksgiving in our household if it wasn't for Mystery Science Theater 3000. And in fact, when I was in graduate school and met Amanda during that time, MST, I think it had only been going on for about 2, maybe 3 years, and I knew about it before and introduced her to it, and so we watched it together. So as we were dating, and then as we became engaged, and then got married, and then afterwards, we watched it together constantly. So it's a big part of our lives.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a good tradition to have.
Yes. But another great tradition is discussing manga.
That's right.
So let's go ahead and get into a discussion for this month's books. And we're going to begin with Distant Neighborhood, the complete edition by Jiro Taniguchi. And this just came out, this volume at least, came out in September of this year from Fanfare, Ponent Mon. But this is not the first time that we're seeing a Distant Neighborhood in English. It was originally published in Japan between 1998 and 1999, I think originally appearing, if I saw correctly, in Big Comic Magazine. And then in English, it was published in 2009 in 2 different volumes through Fanfare Ponent Mon. And so that's basically what we've had since 2009 in English until just a couple of months ago, where Fanfare Ponent Mon came out with a complete edition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were the one, I believe, who originally suggested we cover A Distant Neighborhood, and I'd heard about Jiro Taniguchi before, but I wasn't familiar with this series. How did you come across this? What about it really struck your interest?
Well, I originally came to A Distant Neighborhood through another book, an earlier book that Taniguchi had published, and that is The Walking Man. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember exactly where I saw reference to that. It's been quite a number of years ago. Mm-hmm. But I think that someone that I knew had either taught it in a class or had considered teaching it, so I thought, okay, I'll check it out. Have you read or seen The Walking Man?
No, The Walking Man is the Taniguchi book that I've heard the most about, and I'm kind of the most familiar with. I've seen pages from it here and there online and stuff, and I always wanted to check it out. It's one of those books that it's on the list, and at some point I'll get to it. But I've never actually read anything by Taniguchi's before. But like I said, I was kind of familiar. I'd heard his name before. I'd seen some of his work. I believe he illustrated Hotel Harbor Review. Maybe that was someone else. But he has this reputation as being really influenced by Mobius. He's one of those guys like Katsuhiro Otomo or Keiichi Koike or Katsuya Terada, and I really love the Japanese cartoonists who really fell in love with Mobius and really incorporated a lot of Mobius's kind of stylistic tics into their work. And so because he had that reputation, I was always really interested to give his stuff a read, but I never got the opportunity until now. Yeah.
Well, if you go and read The Walking Man now after having read A Distant Neighborhood, you'll find that tonally they're quite different. And in fact, The Walking Man is what it sounds like. It's about a guy who goes walking all the time. And it's a very kind of a calm, easygoing, contemplative work, and the various chapters, which are basically outings of this guy, is him going out and just walking. Sometimes he'll walk by himself, sometimes he'll walk with his dog, sometimes he'll run an errand, sometimes he just walks for the sake of walking just to see the sights. And it's about the experiences that he has. And so if you're looking for action-packed narrative, The Walking Man is definitely not for you. But there is action that goes on in The Walking Man. It's just a different kind of action. It's more of an interior kind of movement, so to speak. So the things that go on around this guy, what he observes, affects him. And even though we don't know exactly how it affects him more times than not, we know that it does. And I think that's one of the powerful things about The Walking Man, is that if we can place ourselves into his position and try to think, okay, so he's seeing this he's seen these things around him, and it could be something as almost nothing as a duck on a pond, or a child running on a playground, just little things like that. What does that mean to him? And so what's going on in his head, and how is it resonating? And I think that's one of the ways that The Walking Man really draws you in. Now, so that's the first thing that I knew from Taniguchi, and that eventually led me to A Distant Neighborhood. But he's done a lot of other things, and in fact, I think that of publishers who put out his work in English. The one that has done the most is, again, Fanfare and Ponent Mon. They're two different publishers, but they collaborate on a number of Taniguchi's works. So they've done, the Distant Neighborhood volumes, including this complete collection that came out in September. The Walking Man, they also have done volumes of his Summit of the Gods. The Times of Bachan, which he did with Netsuo Sekikawa. But I know that NBM just recently published a book of his, Guardians of the Louvre. It came out earlier this year. I have not read that one. So right now, the only thing I've read of his, The Walking Man, and now A Distant Neighborhood that we're discussing. But there are other things that he's done that I definitely would like to check out.
Yeah, I've, like I said, he had this kind of reputation as being a devotee of Mobius, and I know that the two of them collaborated on a series that I was trying to pull it up and trying to find out. I think Dark Horse might have put out in the early 2000s called Icarus, but I heard it wasn't very good, and so I kind of didn't pick it up. And so yeah, his work is he's put out a lot of work, some of which, like The Walking Man, is I've heard very similar things from other people that it's it's very good, it's very contemplative, and I really would like to get a chance to check that out. But then I've heard I've heard his work is kind of hit or miss. Like you mentioned, the Guardians of the Louvre, I've heard is not that good. But I've heard really, really good things about, like you said, The Summit of the Gods is another series that he's done that I've heard really good things about. So I am eager to, after reading A Distant Neighborhood, to seek out more of his stuff. Certainly.
Yeah. Well, you said you think he has a reputation of having works that are hit or miss critically. I mean, I think that A Distant Neighborhood is definitely a big hit for me. But before we get into what A Distant Neighborhood is all about, though, I have a question for you to see what you think about this. Now, we're talking about some of Taniguchi's work, and he obviously has a lot out in English. He seems to me one of those mangaka that we should know more, that should be getting more attention, more press, but he doesn't, especially compared to other manga creators. And I'm wondering if us not knowing more about Taniguchi's work is a function of who publishes him. Now I mentioned primarily in English his publisher is Fanfare, Ponent Mon, and they do good work. But I think that I think they may have offices in the U.S. I'm not sure, but I know that when we were communicating about this new release, the complete edition, it was from someone at the UK office. So I'm wondering if, for instance, if Taniguchi, if he were published by, let's say, Kodansha, or even someone like a Fantagraphics or a Drawn in Quarterly, if he wouldn't get more attention. In other words, if we wouldn't be talking about him the way we talk about creators like Mizuki and others.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's one I hadn't really thought too much about, because he makes the kind of works like in A Distant Neighborhood, and what I know of his other works like Summit of the Gods and The Walking Man, he makes works that aren't going, they're not really going to be the thing that catches on with people who read Naruto or One Piece or Bleach, who read the very, very popular action-packed kind of shonen manga.
Right.
But there is a contingent of manga readers who, like you said, who might, they'll read work by Fantagraphics, and they'll read manga work that Fantagraphics or Drawn in Quarterly puts out. And I think something like A Distant Neighborhood would fit in very well there. But it is interesting because I don't hear Taniguchi's name being talked about a lot when people talk about great Japanese cartoonists, great Japanese comics, very often. But there are a number of people who are familiar with Taniguchi's work, who are talking about Taniguchi's work, who are absolutely in love with his work. They love The Walking Man. They rush to pick out the latest, when I think Summit of the Gods just concluded and the last volume just came out, they rushed out to get it. And so it's a very small group of people who are kind of consuming his work in the U.S. and talking about his work, but they're talking about it with such kind of incredible praise. It's a weird situation because he should fit very neatly in the kind of alternative comics, independent comics camp, but even there he seems to be undervalued, shall we say.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Now, you're right. He definitely is not the kind of creator you would find at Viz Media. But he, especially something like A Distant Neighborhood, just strikes me as the kind of text that we would find from, let's say, Drawn and Quarterly or Fantagraphics, right? The kind of manga that they're drawn to. So, but let's talk about A Distant Neighborhood. We've talked around it. Now let's really get into the meat of what this book is about. So, if you were going to describe A Distant Neighborhood, again, the complete collection, to the uninitiated, how would you do so?
We've done some really weird books on this show that are very, very difficult to summarize, but I actually think A Distant Neighborhood is one of the easier ones. I would describe it as it's a graphic novel about a middle-aged man who accidentally gets on a train ride back to his hometown. He falls asleep, wakes up as his 14-year-old self, has to deal with life as a 14-year-old, and then he wakes up and goes back home. Obviously there are, there's drama and emotional revelations and stuff like that, but in terms of plot, it's pretty simple.
Yeah, it is. There's a little more to it than But no, you do. I think a great job of laying things out. You're right. He gets on a wrong train, and he does so because he probably had too much to drink the night before. And so that's a little clue in terms of what the protagonist, who is Hiroshi Nakahara, a little clue about the kind of life that he has right now, and we get other little bits of information about what his work life, what his family life especially is like. But anyway, he's out on the job. He has a little bit too much to drink. He gets on the wrong train to go home. He ends up back at his childhood town, and while he's there, he decides to walk around his old neighborhood. Then he goes to his family's burial place, and at his mother's grave, he feels a little dizzy, and something hits him. He doesn't know exactly what. And things get a little strange visually at this point because, for all practical purposes, this, in terms of the art, is realistically drawn. But the times where he is a little uncertain about things, in other words, where we have this kind of shift from past to present, so to speak, or from his present self to the past self, the 14-year-old self, he gets a little dizzy, and even the visuals at times are a little uncertain and ambiguous. And then when he wakes up at the gravesite from just having passed out or getting dizzy, he realizes he's 14 years old, makes his way back to his old childhood house, and his father's there, his mother's there, his young sister Kyoko is there, as they were when he was 14 years old. And so he lives his life, for a while at least, until at one point he goes back to his mother, the family memorial site, and gets a little dizzy, passes out, wakes up, he's back to his 48-year-old self. A lot more complex than you and I just described, but that's basically the gist of what goes on in A Distant Neighborhood. And, given the description, I can't help but think of It's a Wonderful Life. To a degree.
That's there was a number of scenes where he's not sure if he's time traveling, he's not sure if he can change the past or change the future. There were a number of scenes like that like you, I felt I was reminded very, very strongly of It's a Wonderful Life.
Now it's different because in A Wonderful Life, George Bailey is at one point hating his life, and he wonders, at a point where he seems like he's about to throw himself off a bridge, how will things change if I die? Nothing. I've had no impact. In fact, people will be better off if I'm dead. And that's when, Clarence comes down and does his little thing and takes him and shows him what life would be. So it's not the exact same thing, but we do know that Hiroshi feels that his life is not going very well, and that he does we learn as the narrative progresses that he has had thoughts of just up and leaving, just doing something else, because his relationship with his wife isn't what it was. He feels that his relationship with his two daughters isn't that strong, that they'll get by just as fine without him. So, again, a little different from It's a Wonderful Life, but he does have doubts about the life that he's living right now. Now, I don't know if by the end of A Distant Neighborhood, and I don't think this is approaching spoiler territory at all, but I don't think that by the time he gets to the end of what happens in the book, he realizes, oh, well, my life is better than I thought it was. I mean, there are hints of that, but one of the things I appreciate about A Distant Neighborhood is that Taniguchi doesn't hit you over the head with that realization. Mm-hmm. If indeed Hiroshi has that. So I think he comes to a better appreciation of his situation, given this experience of going back to his 14-year-old self. But I think that his understanding of himself is primarily based on what becomes a major plot point in A Distant Neighborhood, and that is what happens with Hiroshi's father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly what I would agree with. Particularly him feeling kind of restless and not feeling like his relationships, his familial relationships, they're not quite the same, and we come to find that that kind of mirrors the way his father was feeling, so unlike you, I do get the sense that he has come to the realization that his experience, he was able to kind of engage with someone who was feeling very similarly, and who maybe chose a different path than he did, and kind of he was able to reflect on the consequences of that, the effects on that, and to better understand why maybe he shouldn't do that, or ways that he can kind of reconnect, or the need to reconnect with his family. But unlike you, I got the sense that he understood that because Taniguchi really hits you over the head with it, and that was one of my only really criticisms of this book, is that at the end he very, very much, to me at least, makes that that kind of the subtext of that scene, or he explicates Hiroshi's interiority in a very expository way that I felt kind of diminishes.
Now, what scene are you referring to?
I'm trying to find it. I'm trying to pull it up right now.
With the father?
It's the one with the father, but also the one with his mother, where she kind of
I see what you're saying.
Reveals that she knows what her husband was going through, and she understands why he made the decision that he made. But yeah, those two scenes, it really struck me as being very, very kind of clear. It almost, I have to go back and look at it again, but when I initially read it, those scenes struck me as Taniguchi going so far as to almost put the words that I was thinking, the reading I had of the series and the reading I had of Hiroshi's interiority and his emotional state in those moments into his mouth. Okay. And so that really struck me as that. Yeah. But I will try and pull it up and tell you exactly what I'm referring to in that.
See, I see what you're saying there. I guess I didn't read the last part of this book in the exact same way that you did, because you're right. I mean, you're right in pointing out that in Hiroshi's last scene with his father, and then soon after that with his mother, when he talks to her about what happens, and we don't want to give too much away about what happens with the father, but I don't think that it ends there, because there are some scenes afterwards where Hiroshi is talking with a young girl that, at least when he originally grew up, she didn't seem to have anything for him, but now she does, and this is Tomoko Nagase. And so he has a conversation with her, and then soon after that, Hiroshi goes over to see his friend Shimada, but he's not there, and of course but a woman who's working at the bar that Shimada's mother owns is there, and so she talks with Hiroshi over a drink, and he gets a little drunk. If you remember this scene, one of the several times in this book that he gets a little drunk. But and so they're having a conversation, and I think that the conversations that Hiroshi has with this woman at the bar, and then right before that with Tomoko, tell us, he's still wavering at this point as to what exactly to do. So I think Hiroshi does realize that he doesn't want to take the route, make the decision that his father did. On the other hand, though, I don't know if by the end of the book he becomes completely okay, let's say, with his decision to go back home. I guess he does to a point, but it's definitely not a George Bailey moment, right? Where he has an epiphanic moment and realizes, oh my God, the life that I have is just wonderful, and I didn't realize it. Almost like even a Wizard of Oz thing. There's no place like home thing. I mean, I never got that sense, and so that's why I said when I didn't think that Taniguchi really hit you over the head with whatever kind of realization that Hiroshi is making. I mean, I think that he comes to some kind of understanding, and he understands himself and his family, his relationship with his family better, but I don't think that it's a dramatic shift. I think it's a little more subtle than that.
Okay, so I was able to find the page that I was referring to. I was actually wrong. It's shortly after he has the conversation with his mother, right at the beginning of chapter 16 on page 368. He's sitting on a park bench, and he asks himself, just who am I now? And then a couple panels later, he narrates to himself, the one who ended up sympathizing with the feelings of my father, encroaching on middle age and wanting to try to do his life over again, was me. When I initially read that scene, it was clear to me that Taniguchi was trying to draw parallels between the way Hiroshi feels as an adult, has his 48-year-old self, and the way his father felt, and the kind of exigence of him, of his leaving, and that panel seemed to me to be really the whole point of the story of Taniguchi telling the story and telling it like this,
right?
And there was something lost, I think, in him making that explicit, making that clear, in drawing those parallels so kind of neatly and obviously that I think the scene and I think the work would have been a little more effective if he had just trimmed some of that text and let those still images of Hiroshi, of him sitting on the bench and kind of wrestling with this, just speak for themselves. I think it would have been a little more dramatic and effective.
Right. I see what you're saying. In some ways we're talking about slightly different things because, earlier I was referring to the realization that the character of Hiroshi makes, and that it wasn't a dramatic emotional shift in such a way that it becomes a little maudlin. But what you were referring to is what Taniguchi is doing in terms of, let's say, telling more than he should be at this point, which he should be doing more of showing. And I agree. I do think that if he had left, let's say, that voiceover from that section that you just read out, we as readers could easily make that connection. In fact, I think that connection is pretty damn clear from almost the beginning when and let's talk a little bit about Hiroshi's father. And again, we don't want to give too much away, but we learn fairly early on when Hiroshi goes back and becomes his older 14-year-old self, or his younger, I guess, 14-year-old self from years ago, that his father at one point left the family. And that, as fate would have it, Hiroshi is living this experience, or has whatever happens to him, this transformation, takes place not long before that event, not quite a year. So he, in the days and months leading up to the date that his father actually does leave, Hiroshi is wondering, what can I do to stop this? Maybe there's something that I can find out that I didn't know when I was a kid and didn't know any better, to why my father did what he did, so that I can maybe talk with him and he won't leave us. And what kind of effect would that have for my life, his mother's life, because, he's very close to his mother, but when his father left, it devastated her, not only emotionally, but also in terms of her health, because she had to end up doing the family business and taking care of the family all by herself. And it probably shortened her life, he speculates, after the father left. And so much of this narrative is based on Hiroshi trying to figure out why his father left and what he could possibly do to keep his father from leaving. And so a lot of the action that takes place revolves around those situations. And so I think even from the beginning, when we get hints that maybe Hiroshi's not happy with life as a 48-year-old, and then he starts to reference his father having left when he was 14, the parallels are starting to set up there. So that scene that you read a moment ago, it probably would have been better if Taniguchi had left that out. Because now that is maybe hitting us over the head a little bit with more, again, telling instead of showing.
As much as I did like A Distant Neighborhood, one of the things that I thought could have been a little stronger was Taniguchi's. I'm thinking of the information he presents. He front loads the book with all of this information that's very obviously a kind of figurative Chekhov's gun. It's information that is so obviously going to be pertinent at some point in the future that it's clunky and kind of clumsy in a way that I think Taniguchi could have delivered that information in a little more subtle, a little more nuanced, a little more naturalistic way. But I thought A Distant Neighborhood, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that it is the first 20, 25 pages do come with a lot of these expository scenes and a lot of expository narration. It's still a really charming, interesting, compelling book.
Okay. Now you just referenced something like, a heavy-handed Chekhov gun phenomena, right? So what were you referring to in the book? I mean, where do you think he was a little too heavy-handed in setting up those?
Really, principally, it's that he's riding on the train and he realizes that he's gotten on the wrong train and where he's going, and he starts to kind of reminisce about his childhood town and his mother and father. That kind of sequence where he's going over his father left when he was such and such, and his mother died, and it was so depressing, and his father leaving really broke his mother, and I'll never forget it. It just seems to be so. Actually, thinking about it now, there's you could kind of give him the benefit of the doubt, and it's you could read it as this kind of Proustian kind of accidental memory or accidental recall. There's a better way to refer to that, and I can't remember it. But reading it, just I think one of my biggest hurdles reading this book was, you described The Walking Man earlier, and that was one thing that I had heard about The Walking Man is it's very kind of placid, still, quiet book. Whereas reading this, it felt very much like there were these kind of plot points that you knew it was kind of moving towards. And once I kind of had that realization that it was very much this, there's an end goal that it's kind of leading to, that these scenes are leading to. It definitely felt to me like it very obviously like set up, like breadcrumbs that would lead you to where you are going.
I see where you're coming from here, and you mentioned earlier when he was on the train, it seemed a little too convenient that he would recall memories of home, his father, and all that. I mean, I saw that as, in terms of the narrative, nicely set up, because at one point, he's not feeling well. He had too much to drink the night before, which is probably one of the reasons why he got on the wrong train. He wasn't thinking clearly. He goes to the restroom in order to splash his face with water, and he looks at himself in the mirror, and when he does, we have an image of his mother's face. Basically, he sees his mother's face in the mirror, which actually does make sense, right? Because you see your own parents in how you look as you're older. And so then that causes a series of memories that make perfect sense, given the fact that he's on a train to his childhood home. So, I mean, all of this kind of makes sense. Now, one of the ways that I read this book, and I don't know if this will make any kind of difference in your appreciation of it or not. I mean, it's definitely not a realistic work. I mentioned earlier that for all practical purposes, the art is realistic. But this book strikes me as something, it's not a fantasy, definitely, in the sense that, we're dealing with elves and such. But I would call it a bit of the fantastic in the way that we have this... we don't want to really call it time travel, but him going back into the body of his 14-year-old self. I mean, obviously, that is not a realistic thing that's going on. But there's quite a bit of ambiguity as to, by the time we get to the end of this book, did he experience what we actually have read, what we've actually read through most of this? Because, I mean, you could make the argument that when he passes out at the family memorial, and he wakes up, he thinks that he had the experience of living his old 14-year-old self for not quite a year. But it could have been just a long and extended dream. Now, because of that ambiguity, I couldn't help but think of this as an example of what used to be called romance writing. Not the kind of Harlequin stuff that people usually think of when it comes to romance, but, the kind of thing that, let's say, Nathaniel Hawthorne was so good at, right? Where you meld the real and the imaginary, where you accentuate what is possible and not just what is probable. So, and there's always in the romance this big question as to what actually happened. Did someone have an experience that they think they had, or was it otherwise? And how are we to interpret this? And, to me, a definition or a description of the romance doesn't get any better than the Custom House section of the Scarlet Letter, and this is when the narrator describes coming into the Custom House at night, and the moonlight coming in through the window casts a look of the room that's completely different than it is during the day, but he knows it's the exact same room, but it's the moonlight that transformed that space. So it's anchored in reality, but the way that room looks in the moonlight makes it something wholly other, right? So it's definitely not imaginary, it's definitely real, but the way that the moonlight, which, traditionally, stands for, among other things, imagination, transforms the reality that we have into something a little less certain than certainty. And so that's, I think, something that we have going on here in A Distant Neighborhood. I would think that this would be, if you wanted to read this within the tradition of, let's say, English language romance writing, as practiced in the UK and the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries, then that would make sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because it's not science fiction. You never really get the sense that you can, with any certainty, say whether it was time travel, whether it was a dream. And I'm not usually a big fan of that stuff, and I don't really love the time travel kind of conceit or the idea of time travel or of him traveling back into his 14-year-old body. But I really like how Taniguchi executes that idea, how he uses that as a vehicle to explore. He's able to have this character revisit this period in his life from a different perspective and bring those that emotional state and that mental state back with him, and revisit his childhood through a completely different lens. And I think, like I said, I think the book is charming and compelling, and I think Taniguchi does an effective job of telling the story, of using that, what I think is kind of a hokey conceit, to great effect. But at the same time, thinking of that scene we were talking about with him on the train, kind of seeing his mother's face in the mirror and having this kind of flashback to her in hospital bed. And then, after he gets off the train, he walks around and kind of reminisces. Presented with that, personally, I just would have liked to have seen that, of just him kind of wandering around and remembering his time as a childhood. But that's, just a matter of personal taste and interests. But but I do like thinking about this as a kind of romantic work, a work that's kind of in places very naturalistic, in other places very fanciful. That's an interesting way of thinking about it that I hadn't before, but I like thinking about it.
Yeah. And visually, what I really appreciate about these, if we want to call them those transformational moments, right? So when he's at the temple as a 48-year-old, he gets dizzy, and then he wakes up as a 14-year-old. And then at the end of the text, where you have the inverse, right? He's 14 years old, he's drunk, he falls asleep, and he wakes up and he's 48 years old. The way that Taniguchi deals with this visually is through two images, and I think that both of these are quite significant. I think the most prominent of which is the butterfly, because when Hiroshi is at the temple, at his mother's temple, and he's praying there at her memorial, we get this image of a butterfly that is in the air, comes down toward the memorial. But the thing that's significant about the butterfly is, and maybe I'm wrong here, but outside of maybe sound effects, it's the only image we have in this entire book that transcends panels. In other words, everything within each panel is, again, with the exception of some of the sound effects, more or less contained within the borders of each individual panel. In other words, you don't have an image, a person, a part of a person, or an object of any sort that spans one panel and then bleeds into another. But with the butterfly, especially at the very beginning of this book, the butterfly transcends or is overlaid of a couple of different panels at times. And so there's something kind of light and fanciful about the butterfly, and that indicates this shift, right, from the present to the past, and then the other direction at the end. And, of course, we see the butterfly at the end of the book. But another image that I think is quite significant, especially in light of my reference to Hawthorne's Custom House, where you have the moon shining into the Custom House room, the image of the moon is prominent as well. And so the moon, along with the butterfly, is there at the very beginning when this transformation takes place, and at the very end. And, of course, we can read a variety of different symbolism into the moon, just as we can the butterfly. But I like the way that Taniguchi deals with the visuals there as bracketing signals, iconic signals that something is about to happen or something is happening. And I don't personally feel that that's, visually speaking at least, too heavy-handed. I like the way that he deals with that.
No, I agree with the butterfly. It's, you see it kind of breaking the panel borders in some. In others, it's, crossing the gutter. It's in the gutter. I think it's a really subtle thing that it's very easy to miss. It's very easy to not pick up on, and it really is effective in kind of communicating the butterfly as this thing that is transcendental almost. It has the ability to transcend what the reader understands to be these kind of demarcations of time and space. Is really effective. The moon thing is interesting as well. I'm not as well versed in you as in I think American literature or American literary tradition, so I didn't pick up on the moon, but hearing you talk about it, I am really struck by how prominent the moon is in a number of those scenes. And I'm sorry I didn't pick up on that at all first reading, but it's interesting that you mention the way he draws these transitions, because you have the butterfly and the moon, and but what really struck me in this kind of visceral way about these scenes is the way he draws. It's almost like a camera moving, or he really affects that perspective from something kind of moving in the air in space, with the way he draws these clouds kind of bending around and stuff like that. So yeah, these transitions are great. They're really great thematically. They're really great visually. I didn't realize how strongly I felt about these until you started talking about them. But
well, let me add really something else into the mix, because it, on the topic of these visual transformations, or the visual representation of the transformation, we mentioned the significance of the butterfly. Now, when I first saw the butterfly, I thought, oh my God. Well, no, I didn't think this at first because I didn't know that we were dealing with some kind of quasi-time travel thing going on. Mm-hmm. Even though it's definitely not your typical sci-fi. It's definitely not sci-fi time travel. But once I got into it, and then I saw what was going on, and I went back and looked. Yeah, the butterfly is prominent there. I couldn't help but think of Ray Bradbury's short story, A Sound of Thunder, and I thought, okay, now. If he's going to do something like Bradbury did in Sound of Thunder, then the butterfly, I thought, would be quite heavy-handed, right? But that's a direction that Taniguchi really doesn't go, and I really appreciate that fact. In other words, there are occasions in this narrative where Hiroshi wonders, if I do something different than what I did growing up, how might it change things later on? In other words, will my life be different than I've already lived it? And I think, part of that comes from his wondering what would happen if he convinced his father not to leave. But a big part of this also is in his relationship with that young woman, Tomoko Nagase. And he wonders, if I do develop a relationship with Tomoko, what might that mean with my 48-year-old life, right? Where I married someone completely different, had a couple of kids, became a salaryman. And, what Taniguchi could have done is to show how certain changes, having gone back in time, can change things. And that kind of approximates something like you find in It's a Wonderful Life as well. But Taniguchi doesn't go down that road, thank goodness, because I think that would have been too easy of a sci-fi-ish trope. And, granted, I like The Sound of Thunder. It's a classic story, but A Distant Neighborhood is something else entirely. Yeah,
when I first read that scene, I didn't think of that Bradbury story specifically, but the kind of underlying idea of it, the butterfly effect, was something that certainly came to my mind as well. And then obviously, as you continue the book, it became the inclusion of that, or the exploration of that idea, seems to not happen. But reading it again, I'm really struck by the butterfly as this creature that is this avatar of transformation, right? It's a thing that metamorphosis is a big part of its life cycle. This physical metamorphosis from the larva to the butterfly, and it's the thing people associate the butterfly as this kind of agent of metamorphosis. And so reading it again, I was struck by that, the significance of the butterfly as representing this change, this growth. And so if I had to hazard a guess, if I had to, really explicate this book, I would focus on the butterfly as this kind of representation of Hiroshi himself, as this thing that is forced to grow, to change, to learn, to become its truer self, or what have you.
Now, before we leave Distant Neighborhood, I want to ask you something that doesn't have so much to do with the story. So I guess in this way, it's kind of a paratextual question. But, we see in the text that the name Frederick Bollier, and it's Boilet, I guess that's how you pronounce Bollier. He is listed as the one who did the graphic adaptation. Now, what is meant here by graphic adaptation?
That is a good question, and is one I can actually answer.
Because it's not translator.
Right. So when Humanoids was releasing their Barbarella, their first Barbarella book, I think 2 years ago now, they announced it, and they had it listed in previews and on their website, and in the book, so Kelly Sue DeConnick was the adapter, right? The adaptation was by her, and I had no idea what that meant. I never heard that term used in translation, anything like that. And I came across an interview with her where someone had asked her that, and she explained that in a lot of the comics translations, there's someone whose job it is to take the raw translation and to basically take the text and rewrite it, quote unquote, adapt it for English speaking audiences instead of just a direct, straight Japanese to English translation. It would be a modification of the language, the English language, so that it fit naturally, so that it sounded like it was being spoken or being written by someone for whom English is their primary language or first language. And that seems to be the job of the translator, at least from what I understand in prose. And I had never seen anyone listed with that title in comics until recently. But if I had to hazard a guess, that is my understanding of the title of adaptation when it comes to translated works. So I would say that Frederic Boulet is someone who kind of wrote the English script of this based on a Japanese translation that he may have done himself, or he may have had someone else do. I'm not sure. Because
the book has a translator.
Yeah, so then my guess would be that they took that translation and they, like in Kelly Sue DeConnick's case, they were taking a 30-year-old translation of Jean-Claude Forest's Barbarella, and she was updating it so that it sounded more naturalistic, more colloquial. Slang and terminology was more contemporary. So I don't know if that was as necessary here because, A Distant Neighborhood was published in 1998 originally, and English translations weren't even that far behind, only about 10 years. So I don't really know to the extent of what he did with that translation, but there was something where he kind of changed the language and he messed with it and fudged it and kind of got it to where it needed to be.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of those distinctions in terms of the larger work of translation, right? That there's a translator and an adapter, I guess. That's something to ask our fellow co-host of the Comics Alternative, Edward Govan, because he's a translator.
Yeah, he would probably be able to offer more, especially since he's, translated comics as well. But yeah, it's like you was I had only seen, I had read comics that had been translated from Spanish and Italian and French and Japanese, and I had always seen translator or the translation was by such and such. I had never seen adaptation by or adapted by in comics, and so I was really curious what that meant. And fortunately, someone else got the opportunity to ask Kelly Sue DeConnick, and she was able to explain.
Yeah, because usually, adapted by refers to going from one medium to another, right?
Right.
So from a novel, prose novel, to a comic, or from a film to a book, or what have you, right? So if something in comics is adapted, usually it's something that, let's say, has a cinematic or maybe a prose point of origin that was then turned into a comic.
Right, and it's unusual also because you in prose, like I said, it's really the job of the translator to do that work, and so it did strike me as it seemed like a job that the translator would do, and it's a weird title in comics. It's a weird title, but that's a good question because I think I assume a lot of people have it.
Well, let's move on to the second book that we're looking at this month, and this is Attack on Titan Anthology. This is published by Kodansha Comics, and it came out last month. October 18th, I think, was the release date. And this book, as the title suggests, the word anthology, it's made up of 12 different contributions and an extra at the end, if you want to include that. So I guess that would make 13. Kind of a tease of an app, but we can talk about that separately. So there are 12 contributions, but 2 of those contributions are in serial form. In other words, those are spread out across the entire volume. So we have, I guess, 10, if you want to call them one-shot stories, based on Attack on Titan. And then we have the 2 serials, and one of those serials is by Evan Dorkin, and the other one is by Guinevere Valentine and David Lopez. So, I mean, there's a lot here to chew on, and, you know, this reminds me of something that you and I were discussing just last month, and that was the Neo-Parasite F. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's obviously there are some similarities between the 2 projects. They're both, kind of tribute collections to these very popular manga series by a number of cartoonists. Obviously, the big difference being Neo-Parasite F it's all Japanese cartoonists, right, whereas Attack on Titan it's all American, or not American, but they're all cartoonists Western, who work primarily in American comics.
Right, exactly.
But one of the things we talked about when we were talking about Neo-Parasite F was neither one of us was really familiar with the original property, and so it was really difficult for us to get a handle on what was going on in some of the shorts, you know, who were the characters. We couldn't really understand the jokes as well as maybe people familiar with Parasite or Neo-Parasite would, but Attack on Titan is a little more prominent. It's a little more of the moment. So I was curious how you found this compared to this. Was this kind of easier to get into some of the stories? Was it easier to understand some of the concepts than it was for Neo-Parasite F?
Yes, and in multiple ways. It was easier to understand because before reading Attack on Titan Anthology, I did some reading in Attack on Titan. But being familiar with Attack on Titan is easier than being familiar with, let's say, the original Parasite, because the original Parasite, I think I don't think there's an edition in English now that's available. I mean, you can find maybe older copies, but I think it's out of print. Maybe I'm wrong there. But it's much easier to find, you know, original English translations, obviously, of Attack on Titan, because it is a hot commodity, and it has been since it was first translated in 2012. So, you know, I'm glad that we are discussing for this month Attack on Titan Anthology, because it forced me to finally read some Attack on Titan. And over the past, maybe 3 or 4 years, because I think my daughter Zoe was on board Attack on Titan almost from the very beginning, she's been wanting me to read Attack on Titan. And I said, yeah, I will when I get the time. But I kept putting it off. It's kind of, you know, kicking that proverbial can down the road. And over the past few years, I've even gotten her, my wife and I have gotten her over the holidays or for birthday presents, those big colossal editions of Attack on Titan, right? And so far we have 2 volumes. And so last month, knowing what we were going to discuss, you know, the Attack on Titan Anthology, I said to Zoe, you know, do you mind if I borrow that first volume of Attack on Titan Colossal Edition? She said, oh, yeah, sure. And she was glad that I was finally reading that. That thing is a behemoth.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, and so I didn't. Now, in this Colossal Edition, they made up, I think, of 5 volumes, the collections of Attack on Titan. I didn't get through all of the first Colossal Edition of Attack on Titan, but I got through what, in essence, is the first 3 volumes, collected volumes of Attack on Titan. So I knew enough, I read enough to understand the context, the premise, what all's going on. In other words, I read enough to where everything I read in the Attack on Titan Anthology, I could fairly well understand. In other words, I wasn't lost in ways that I was lost with Neo-Parasite F. And you had a similar experience?
Yeah, I haven't gotten a chance to read any of the Attack on Titan manga, so I apparently wasn't as familiar with.
Oh, so you haven't read it? I thought you maybe.
No. I'd seen a couple episodes of the anime, so I was familiar with the basic premise, and I kind of understood who the couple main characters were and what was going on and what the Titans were and the kind of makeup of this world of Attack on Titan. But I wasn't as familiar with it as you. I certainly haven't read the first 3 volumes of the manga, but it was a lot easier for me for that reason to understand, kind of follow the plot of these different stories, but also because I think the premise of Attack on Titan it's much more easier to explain this world than maybe some of the stories of Neo Parasite F, where it's full of these jokes that refer to characters and situations that people like us may not be familiar with. But in Attack on Titan, the anthology has a pretty simple preface. X amount of years ago, Titans began attacking the world. Now humanity lives in a big city with 3 rings, and it's much easier to understand some of these stories that don't involve the main characters or any plot points from the comic. You just have to know, okay, Titans, they're bad, they're giant, they're naked, they eat people, and everybody lives in this walled city. So I think Neo Parasite F had a more of an uphill battle, kind of getting unfamiliar readers to understand the world than Attack on Titan. But yeah, I found this book much easier to follow and understand, and even the jokes, like Evan Dorkin's jokes, which do kind of reference pretty heavily at certain points in his strips. The characters and character traits of
especially
some of these
Eren.
characters.
Aaron's
right,
one of the main characters of Attack on Titan.
And he's the butt of a number of jokes, and the way he kind of conducts himself and speaks. And I think Dorkin was able to tell jokes about those with that as its focus, and I wasn't totally lost on me, who has basically zero engagement with Attack on Titan. So
yeah. Now we should mention that in the Attack on Titan anthology is a collection of stories that, in one way or another, are based on Hajime Ishiyama's actual Attack on Titan, but not all the contributions are based in that world. So some of the contributions, for instance, the one by the very first one by Ray Fox, Scott Snyder, and Raphael Albuquerque, is more inspired by Ishiyama's Attack on Titan than otherwise. But there are some contributions that are heavily based in that world, in the exact same location, exact same setting. Others use Ishiyama's Attack on Titan as maybe inspiration, or they base it on a world that's premised on what we have in Attack on Titan.
Yeah, they're set in the world of Attack on Titan for the most part. Even Scott Snyder and Ray Fox, which there's kinds of cheats. It's basically like a zombie story, but it's set at the very, very, very beginning of the world of Attack on Titan. In 2030, I think, is the timestamp they give. But yeah, they play a lot faster and looser with what from the original property needs to be included than Neo Parasite F did. And I think to a lot of these stories benefits.
Yeah. So I guess for our listeners who may not have read one panel of Ishiyama's Attack on Titan, the question then becomes, would they be able to appreciate or get something out of Attack on Titan anthology? I think yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, even if they don't read any Attack on Titan to prepare them for the anthology, if nothing else, just go to Wikipedia, read the basic premise of Attack on Titan, and I think that gives you enough to enjoy what's going on here with the Attack on Titan anthology.
Yeah, although don't read too far into the Attack on Titan Wikipedia, because I have been there, I've read the plot summary, or I have tried to, and it gets very, very convoluted and very, very complicated very quickly.
Well, okay, that's understandable because, I mean, this is an extremely popular property, and, I mean, you get people who are Attack on Titan fanatics, right? So you could expect that kind of attention on a Wikipedia page, that it's going to become very long, involved, and convoluted. But if they just read, you know, the first part of the plot, then I think they'll have enough to really enjoy what's going on in the anthology.
Yeah, certainly.
Yep. So, you know, as with any anthology, it's always difficult to decide where are we going to start, right? We don't want to go chronologically, you know, start with the very first story in the collection and then work our way forward. That just seems a rather pat way of approaching it, and also it'll take too long. So maybe a way of doing this is what we did last month with Neo Parasite F, is talk about those contributions that really stood out to each of us.
Do you want to? So which you want to go first?
Well, let me ask. Well, name one that really stood out for you.
Yeah, you know, I will say that, you know, this anthology has been billed as kind of a number of really high-profile American or Western cartoonists and writers and artists are getting a chance to work on this very, very popular property, Attack on Titan. But I will say that even though, you know, many of these people are very high-profile, the first story is by Scott Snyder and Raphael Albuquerque.
Henry Fox.
And who co-wrote it with Scott Snyder. And, you know, Gail Simone and Phil Jimenez have a story in here. You know, there's a number of high-profile, you know, American writers and artists and cartoonists. I will say I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of those people. I don't really love Gail Simone. I don't love Scott Snyder. And so while I was able to really follow their work and understand it really easily, it didn't really totally work for me the way that I think people who are fans of their work may, you know, be more into their stories. So for that reason, the only two that I really, really loved, I think there were a lot that I thought were okay. They, you know, I certainly wouldn't describe them as bad, but the only two that I really, really loved were Bahamut by Ron Wimberly and Memory Maze by Tomer and Asif Hanukkah. I thought those two stories were exceptionally. They stood out from the rest of the stories, both visually and the way they were written, the quality of their writing, and it was I think the Hanukkah brothers and Wimberly both have writing styles that are much more consistent with my aesthetic and narrative interests.
You know, I have those as two of the standouts for me. They're not the only two standouts, but you know, I thought that both of them, but especially Wimberly's, is one that would resonate with you. Yeah, you know, I'm a huge fan of Ron Wimberly's, as you could probably guess by the essay for you that I wrote recently. And I wouldn't describe for people listening, the name of his story in this anthology is called Bahamut, and you know, it's not my favorite Wimberly story. You know, I always love seeing him being able to write and draw for himself and not having to work with a writer. I think the work he does by himself is always kind of a cut above the work he does with a writer. As good as I think, you know, as much as I like those like She-Hulk issues or the Wolverine and the X-Men issues he did a couple years ago. So it's certainly not my least favorite Ron Wimberly story, but it does kind of feel constrained by the limitations imposed, simply, you know, the need to work in this world, the need to work with these certain kind of conceits, limits it to a degree, but absolutely, it's a terrifically drawn story. I think Wimberly's writing is as smart as ever. It's structured in this very interesting, chiastic way that I had to keep going back and looking and making sure these panels weren't identical, because they are almost, and it's just really a thoughtful, beautifully drawn story, really smartly written, and really an interesting little slice of Attack on Titan, I thought. Exactly. And one of the things I really appreciated about this is one of those stories that is set in the world of Ishiyama's Attack on Titan, but it's not really about about what we find in Attack on Titan. Now, this is the story, Bahamut, of a playwright who's called a maestro at what he does, named Berthold Weil. And we see him at the very beginning. He's, has a successful play. And what happens in the opening pages of this story becomes quite significant when you get to the end of it. But, he is a well-respected playwright, has, a very dedicated fan base. And we see that as the story progresses, he meets someone that I assume to be his lover, and we find out that they are lovers. And this woman that seems to be human turns out to be, from what I gather, a Titan, or someone who can transform, kind of like the character Aaron in the original. And the playwright is accused of being a traitor because of this. And so, it's a fairly straightforward story, but what I really enjoyed about Bahamut, in addition to, Wimberly's art, I agree with you, there's that, but there are just a variety of little touches that he throws into the story. So, for instance, Berthold, the playwright, that's Prince, right? It looks like the purple one. And he even has purple glasses. He looks almost exactly like Prince.
That's tough because, especially if you read the story, there's a scene towards the end of Wimberly's story where a number of Titans attack this kind of town or village or whatever, and I think they're all drawn from people. I know one of them is certainly Donald Trump.
Right, that's another thing I was
going
to mention. Yeah.
So I didn't notice that it looked, this character bore a resemblance to Prince, but based on Wimberly's inclusion of all of these other, real life figures, and I think when he drew this, Prince was still alive. So I didn't notice that when I first read it, but I'll have to go back and take a second look because it's very, very possible that Wimberly might have done that on purpose.
Right, but little things like that. I was going to mention the Titan that looks like Donald Trump, but also at one point when we do see Berthold with the woman Sophie, that he goes on it looks like a picnic with her, and at the moment where things are going to get intimate, one of the things that Wimberly does is in a panel with no visuals, it just says, due to the depiction of a woman's pleasure, this and the following panel have been removed. I assure you, it was all very tasteful, but nevertheless too explicit for this particular book. In place of those drawings, the author humbly offers you Baudelaire's La Gente. And, of course, La Gente is the giantess. And, of course, that's what this woman ends up being, right? This female Titan, or at least it seems like she is. So little touches like this. I think this is one of the more clever and well thought out and imaginative takes on Attack on Titan in this collection. Now, the other one that you mentioned, the Hanukkah brothers, Asaf and Tomer's Hanukkah Memory Maze. I mean, this is one that I think is perfect to end with. I mean, it really does send this volume off with a bang. And one of the things that I found particularly useful, first off, it's a great story. I mean, I like the work of the Hanukkah brothers, but, two Israeli writers and artists. But what the Hanukkahs do with color and the way that color is used iconographically to link events, past and present, to point out particular themes that are quite subtle in this story, I think is genius. And I don't know, I hate people who throw around the word genius so easily, so maybe I shouldn't say it's genius. I think it's well thought out, let's say. And it works really well in this story, Memory Maze.
Yeah, that's certainly the color work that they do in this story is something that I felt similarly about. It's very striking, and I felt similarly about this story that I did to Wimberly's story, and that I liked it quite a bit, and it was certainly I think one of the two best stories in the book. But I did feel it was limited by the need to include certain things that I think if the Hanukkah brothers weren't bound to that, it could have been a little a little stronger, a little more interesting. But I think given the limitations that they were working with, they did exceptional work. And like you said, they're both really terrific cartoonists. In their own right. I know Tomera's sense of color and design is really fantastic. I love the sound effects in their story, the way they letter those sound effects as being at certain points embossed and other points kind of debossed. Mm-hmm. There was this kind of weird dimensionality in this. It's hard to describe because some of the sound effects, parts of the letters are flat, but then they kind of sink in. And I think the way they did that is really striking and really aesthetically really beautiful. But the colors, that was one of the pages that I kept kind of going back to was the page where Eve there's no borders on the panels. It's 3 panels. There's no borders. It's a black background, and it's her kind of saying goodbye to her son, her child. That was a page I kept coming back to. I kept looking at because their choice of colors, those pinks and those blues, those certain hues of those colors against that black background pop so much. It's so just striking, and it's just a really, really terrific looking story.
Right, and along with that, you mentioned those colors. I mean, not only are they quite effective aesthetically in terms of popping in places, but also I think the colors draw your attention to various parts of the story in different ways. So, for instance, you mentioned the pinks. The mother or wife Eve, and we see her. It basically kind of 2 time periods, that they're, I guess, what we could call the flashback parts where, you pointed out one of those instances where she is with her young son and saying goodbye. So we get something like that at the very beginning, right, where she is with her young son. She's wrapping him up to make sure that he's okay and warm when he goes out. But when we first see her, she is working on this quilt that is primarily light pink, but there are also some darker pink in it, some gold, some bluish hues. And then the same colors that you can find on her quilt also define the skin of a rabbit that her husband brings home and skins. Mm-hmm. They're the exact same colors. And so right there, we're making those visual links via color from something that has an idea of memory and warmth and comfort, that's associated with her son, to something that is about death and meat and consumption, which tells us something about the Attack on Titan here. Same thing with when we see early on, she pricks her finger as she's sewing, and just as she pricks her finger, her husband, who comes back with the rabbit, has blood on his fingers, but then we see that the red smoke from the sighting of a Titan comes up, and the red smoke looks like dripping blood in that really long panel and we don't have page numbers here. So again, the way that the Hanukkah brothers use visuals, but particularly colors, to link certain scenes, certain times, and to do so thematically, I think, is one of the things I loved about Memory Maze.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very similar to what I appreciated about Wimberly's story, is these little subtleties of detail, these little subtleties of structure and theme. His story opens with Bertolt Weil is putting on a play, and the first page, which kind of depicts the play, is reflected in the last page of the story, and he similarly makes these connections between scenes and moments to evoke ideas and themes and emotions. And I think the subtlety with which both Wimberly and the Hanukkah brothers kind of tell their story, the intricacy of detail and the layering of detail, really goes a long way to make these stories as strong as they are, and to set them, I think, kind of far and away ahead of the other stories in the collection.
Mm-hmm. you were telling me a couple of the stories that really stood out to you. Wimberley's Bahamut and then the Hanukkah Brothers Memory Maze. And, those are two that stand out for me. This may be a little too predictable for listeners who have heard me many, many times talk about this creator on the Comics Alternative. But my favorite has to be, just because it's so much fun, Evan Dorkin's and his wife Sarah Dyer's strips Attack on Titan. Mm-hmm. Those are just hilarious. And we get, about 4 of those, maybe 5 throughout the book. And basically what we have, and this is the kind of thing that Dorkin would do with his Dork strips, is we get these, 4-panel strips that are self-contained, and we get about 5 of these strips with each installment of Attack on Titan. And basically what it's doing, you're right, this is the contribution in the anthology that I think is most embedded in the world of Ishiyama's Attack on Titan, yet it does so in a very parodic way. He's having fun with Attack on Titan, as you can tell by the name, Attack on Titan. So, for instance, on the very first contribution here, the first part in the serial of Attack on Titan, we get the strip is called Bite Club, and Aaron in Attack on Titan, he's the character who, when he's bitten, he mm-hmm. becomes a Titan, or mm-hmm. in some ways. And so in this strip, they're being attacked, and so a friend is calling for him, quick, you have to turn into a Titan, help us. And he bites at first what we think of as his hand, but it's not his hand, but it's a friend's hand. It's little things mm-hmm. like that. Mm-hmm. And so these are just really silly. And another thing on that first page, lesser known abnormal Titans. And abnormal Titans, I haven't gotten to the point in Attack on Titan where abnormal Titans are explained thoroughly. They just touch upon them, so I don't know what makes them abnormal, just that they're a little unusual and stranger than the normal Titans. But we have a variety of different Titans that look funny. There's Papa Titan, Mama Titan, Baby Titan, School Idol Titan, Bunny Titan, Vanilla Ice Titan, and of course, Dorkin's having a lot of fun with this. Colostomy Titan. there's a Titan with a colostomy bag right next to him. Invisible Titan. And then right next to Invisible Titan, which we can't see, is Chibi Invisible Titan, which we can't see as well. Stick Figure Titan, Cliched Frenchman Titan, Minecraft Titan, and then Camera Shy Titan, which you just see the guy's leg as he's walking off panel. So little things like that. Again, the kind of humor that Evan Dorkin is known for. But I have to tell you, the crown of Attack on Titan is the last installment of this series. And this is when, Dorkin and Dyer just let it all go, right? Mm-hmm. At this point, they're being attacked, and so in this strip in particular that I want to read, it's called Self-Harm and WTF. And a WTF, right? So they're about to be attacked, and so they think that if the what do you call them? Not the Rangers, but the survey crew. What are they called?
The Survey Corps.
The Survey Corps. Yes, that's it. They're biting their hands, thinking that maybe one of them will change into a Titan. Because they want to find out if there's, I guess at this point, if there's a traitor, right? And so the traitor would be someone who, when he or she is bitten, becomes a Titan. Yeah, that's it. Mm-hmm. And so the people are ordered to bite themselves. And so they're biting themselves, and then one guy says, no one changed into a Titan. And then someone says, no, wait, look, over there. And there's some kind of big boom and transformation. We don't know what it is, but in the final panel, someone says, holy shit, Connie is actually world-renowned painter Bob Ross. And then Bob Ross is standing there and says, hello, everybody. But then someone else says, this makes no fucking sense. I want out of this comic. And then Evan Dorkin underneath writes, isn't Bob Ross dead? and then it just gets crazier from there. And so this is the kind of thing that this over-the-top kind of humor is what Evan Dorkin is known for, and it's what I love about him. And I think that, yeah, perhaps Bahamut or Memory Maze or Under the Surface or even Faith Aaron Hicks's The Titan's Laugh may be a little more sophisticated, but in terms of sheer enjoyment value, for me, you can't beat Evan Dorkin and Sarah Dyer's Attack on Titan.
Yeah, I really like Dorkin's work. I don't know if it kind of resonates with me quite as much as it resonates with you, but I do enjoy it quite a bit. And yeah, that was another one of these. I hate to say stories, and I hate to say shorts because it is serialized in like 4 parts, but it's another one of those works in here that I really enjoyed, and I'm glad I got a chance to read, even though I'm not a huge fan of Attack on Titan.
You know, another one that I really appreciated was, this comes not quite in the middle of the collection, but Skies Above. This is written by Rihanna Pratchett and Ben Applegate, who also works with Kodansha, with illustration by Jorge Corona. I think that this is a really nice story, and this is another one of those, like Memory Maze, that is set in the world of Attack on Titan, but it's not really of the world of Attack on Titan. Mm-hmm. What did you think of that one?
You know, that was another one that just, it didn't... You know, there's really nothing about it that I can really point to and say, well, this doesn't work. This is stupid. This is boring. This is dull. It's just, for whatever reason, it was a story that it just didn't really hit me where it needed to hit me. It didn't resonate with me. It didn't move me in any real meaningful way. So I think a lot of people who read this will get a lot out of that story, and they'll enjoy it quite a bit. But for me personally, there just wasn't. It just wasn't kind of what I look for when I in the comics that really excite me. It wasn't. It was definitely not that.
Well, I'm wondering if there's a reason for that, and that is that you haven't, and I know I haven't, read far enough into Attack on Titan to see what some of this story is playing off of. So basically what we have in Skies Above, we have primarily 2 female characters, right? And one of them is working on a flying machine. Mm-hmm. And then the other is her friend, I guess, / lover, who's helping. And they're doing this in a very secretive way. And we don't know exactly why they're doing it so secretive, why they're at a place of higher learning, I guess. And they have this flying machine that they're working on in what looks like a basement or the catacombs or what have you. But there's a reason why they're doing this in secret. And my guess is that in the actual Attack on Titan, we come to a part of the story where the Survey Corps or the police force within the walled cities start to become a little more repressive in terms of how they deal with their citizens, worried that there may be some kind of collaboration or rebellion in some way that would work against their fight of the Titans. At least that's what I'm guessing from having read this anthology. And this is one of those stories, I think, where you see the tension between the city authorities and those who are citizens of the walled worlds, right? And at least up until the 3rd volume of Ishiyama's Attack on Titan, which is what I've read up to, I haven't really seen that kind of tension, but my guess is that there's more of that tension that's developed as the series continues, because this is probably what the Skies Above is playing off of. And so if that's the case, then the Skies Above is a story about not just self-expression, but also rebellion, because I think this self-expression, rebellion comes out toward the very end when we see these 2 women are taking off in the machine, and we see that there is more to their relationship than just friends, right? There's something that's probably not going to be accepted by the general population. And so, in other words, they're doing something that the eyes of the law, the authority, may not look kindly upon. So I think that's one of the things that gives this story its poignancy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there might be something there, and I'd be willing to read more of the actual Attack on Titan series and revisiting this to see this, but it's probably more because this story is like a lot of these stories, and it's for me, it was the problem with not just that story, but Scott Snyder's story, Gail Simone's story, the illustrated guide to the Walled City, one whose creative team I can't recall right now.
That was Genevieve Valentine and David Lopez.
And a lot of those, they just, like I said, they have completely different aesthetic concerns than me, and the things that they are trying to do, and the kind of comic book traditions, the I guess more or less mainstream American comic book tradition that a lot of those stories come out of, are just things I don't really have a lot of interest in, which makes it difficult for me to really get into those stories, really appreciate those stories, really enjoy those stories. But at the same time, I think qualifying my criticism of them with that gives people the indication that if you are interested in Scott Snyder's work or Gail Simone's work, I think those stories would appeal to you. They would have a lot more to offer you.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that, if you want to look at the entire collection, there is nothing. I mean, we've been talking about some of our favorites, or at least those contributions that stand out for whatever reason to each of us. There is no contribution in this anthology that I did not like. In other words, I think all of them are well worth reading and liking in one way or another. And some of them do very different things than the others do. Case in point, Evan Dorkin is doing something vastly different from what Wimberly is doing in Bahamut. But, I think all of them are well worth reading. So I don't want to suggest that, at least for me, in pointing out some of those that really stand out, I'm suggesting that the others don't work as well. No, I mean, they're all good. It's just these are some of the ones that really stand out. You mentioned just a moment ago another one of the serials, along with Dorkin and Dyer's Attack on Titan, and this is Valentine and Lopez's An Illustrated Guide to the Glorious Walled Cities. And I think this is in, 4 parts?
Yeah.
When I read the first couple, I thought, okay, this is nice and this is quaint. And Lopez's art has that sense of quaintness, right? That it's based in the world of Attack on Titan, but there's not much of the violence and darkness and direness that comes through in the manga. This seems to be that, given this dark world, there are nonetheless moments worth celebrating and appreciating. And what we have in An Illustrated Guide to the Glorious Walled Cities, at least in the first 2 installments, look to be selections from guides, right? Guidebooks of if this part within the walled cities, this is what you'll find. Their dress, their customs, the kind of foods you can find there, the sights that you could see, where to go that other people don't know. In other words, what you would expect to find in some kind of travel guide. And they seem pleasant enough. Lopez's art looks really nice. Very inviting. But then the last 2, they tend to take a different turn, the Illustrated Guide to the Glorious Walled City, where it's not what you thought it originally was. Now, these seem to be guides that are written by a character named Hilda Gardner. And in the first 2 parts of the Illustrated Guide to the Glorious Walled Cities, we see her image. And we really don't see anything outside of the, guidebook selections themselves. But with the 3rd and then the 4th installment of the Illustrated Guide, we see that there's something else going on. That this is being heavily edited, and the people who are either editing this or who are not pleased with what is being written are the authorities in the Glorious Walled Cities. And so I think that one of the things I appreciated about the Illustrated Guide to the Glorious Walled Cities is what I appreciated about The Skies Above, is that they both bring to the fore what I assume to be a subtext in Attack on Titan, and that is the tension between the guardians, the authority figures within the walled cities, and the people who actually live there.
Yeah, I think that's one that it's another one of those that I didn't really enjoy it, but at the same time I don't really have any significant or meaningful criticism of it, because my reaction to it was totally like a gut reaction, personal reaction. Just it's the format of that story. It's very much like when I open a comic book and there is too much text. It's my eyes just glaze over. But I think but like you said, I think there's for people for whom that is not the case, which I assume that is based on how many comics I open up that feature that much text. I assume that this is a unique. I have a very special reaction to this kind of thing, and I think people for whom that is not the case, who don't just kind of glaze over based on the format of the comic, there's a lot there for them to get at and enjoy, and yeah, like I said, it's not significant, it's not meaningful or substantive criticism of it, but I think a lot of people will get a lot out of the story, like you said.
Yeah. And, you know, there are others, too, that we haven't even mentioned, or at least haven't mentioned much, that I think are really good in their own ways. So, for instance, I really liked Faith Erin Hicks's The Titan's Laugh, because that did have, as the title suggests, a comedic edge to it. And I think the same thing is going on with Sam Humphrey and Damon Scott's Attack on Playtime. And the thing that strikes me about both of those stories is that the art is something that you would find in, let's say, something like an all-age comic. And so it definitely has a younger feel to it. I think that is one of the reasons why these stories have less of a dark tone and more of a jovial or a non-threatening jovial tone, right? Because, you know, Dorkin and Dyer's Attack on Titans definitely is jovial, but, you know, with words like, you know, fuck in it, I don't think it's for necessarily younger readers. Whereas I think younger readers could read Attack on Playtime and The Titan's Laugh and really get a lot out of it. I mean, there's something there. And, you know, these are people who do write for younger readers as well. I mean, I also really like Cy Spurrier, Kate Brown, and Paul Dunfield's Fee, Fi, Fo. I think that's very well done.
Yeah, there's it's interesting that you say that Faith Erin Hicks and Sam Humphries and Damien Scott's stories could be read by younger readers, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, aesthetically, it's very consistent with what we see, the look of children's books or children's comics or all ages comics, or even like YA young adult comics from publishers like First Second.
Right. These are definitely first, second time comics.
Right. And I think that's a sentiment that I would absolutely agree with. And this hadn't really occurred to me until you were talking about the juxtaposition between those stories and Evan Dorkin's, which is kind of violent and over the top. And there's cursing and, you know, even Wimberly's comic, which features it's not explicit about sex, but it pretty openly features sex and sexuality, and you know, it leads me to ask, who do you think this anthology is for? Because I think there's stuff in here like Faith Erin Hicks that is going to appeal primarily to people who are going to pick up her comics like Friends with Boys or The Nameless City. Right. Whereas, you know, those Evan Dorkin strips might not be appropriate for, you know, an 11 or 12 or 13 or 14-year-old. But at the same time, an adult who is going to be really enjoying and picking this up for Ron Wimberly's or the Hanukkahs or Dorkin strip, they may not really be into Faith Erin Hicks. Do you think this is a book designed to – some strips are going to appeal to some people, and some – like, who do you think this book is really – who do you think its target audience is? Oh,
I think it's a broad target audience. And so I say, you know, everyone. And this is what the editors of this are the aforementioned Ben Applegate and Janine Schaefer. And I think I would assume that they intentionally included different styles, different tones, and different potential audience bases in the selections that they included here, because there is something to appeal to a variety of different comics readers. In fact, one of the stories we haven't even discussed yet is Attack on Demon Con by Brennan Fletcher, Cameron Stewart, and Babs Tarr. So, I mean, you know, I'm not really a fan of Batgirl, and this is what these guys are really famous for, working together. In fact, they have an upcoming comic with Image, Motor Crush. I'm curious to see what that's like. But, you know, this would appeal to a different kind of reader than, let's say, that Faith Erin Hicks or Sam Humphries would appeal to, which is definitely different than the kind of readers that would be drawn to Scott Snyder, Ray Fawkes, Michael Avon Oeming, and several others here, Paula Rivera, which is different from those who, like me, are drawn to Evan Dorkin. As well as, the Hanukkah brothers and Wimberly. So I think that there is such a variety of entries here that you can't just put your finger on one kind of reader. I think anyone who appreciates Attack on Titan, whether they read it regularly, whether they are interested in it in passing, whether they have picked it up at some point in life, or know someone who's read or is reading Attack on Titan, that they can pick up the Attack on Titan anthology and find something that they'll like.
Fair enough.
Now, do you think, I think of that as the book's strength, but I'm getting in your response, you may not necessarily think that's the case.
Well, it's something I actually hadn't occurred to me that there is such this wide, eclectic mix of different tones, obviously aesthetics and kinds of stories being told, but the kind of person I would give a Faith Aaron Hicks comic to, I wouldn't necessarily give the Ronald Wimberly to, and so I don't know if I'm necessarily like I think that mix is to the books. It's not a weakness of the books per se, because I think appealing to a broad audience, you do have people who are going to pick it up because, oh man, we never get a Ron Wimberly comic. It's been, it's between Prince of Cats and like Lighten Up, there was like nothing. And so we're going to jump at the chance to get anything we can from him or from the Hanukkahs, but then you'll have people picking it up for just the Faith Aaron Hicks comic or for the Cameron Stewart and Brendan Fletcher and Babs Tarr comic. So I think there is some merit from like a marketing perspective of building the book this way, but I'm just thinking my reservation is that you couldn't, because this book features something like Bahamut or Attack on Titan, you couldn't give it to the 9-year-old or 10-year-old or 11-year-old for whom the Faith Aaron Hicks story is most appropriate, the demographic that it's most going to appeal to. Would be my kind of reservation about it, saying it's a strength necessarily. But like I said, it's not something I've really gotten a lot of time to think about, because it is something that just occurred to me. But that's kind of where my head's at.
That's a good point that you make. And if any of our listeners is thinking about maybe getting Attack on Titan anthology as, let's say, a holiday gift for someone, if this someone is of a particularly young age, then we should point out, as Shea and I have been saying, that not everything in the anthology would be appropriate. So definitely keep that in mind. So I guess that would be a potential drawback. But I like that variety in tone and styles and potential audiences, because I think that tells us something about the people who read Attack on Titan, right? I think Attack on Titan has such a large following in the United States that it draws readers who appreciate a variety of different kind of comics, from, let's say, the young adult or all-age kind of comics that we would find in First Second, to, let's say, more alternative stuff that we would find with Wimberly or the Hanukkah brothers, to the kind of in-your-face, offbeat, sometimes over-the-top stuff that we find with Dorkin and Dyer. In other words, because the readers of Attack on Titan are so broad, why shouldn't the entries in the anthology also be based to those kind of readers, that broad base as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely some strong points that in the pro column, and I think the benefits of an anthology, the format of an anthology, the real appeal to me, at least as a reader of comics anthologies, prose anthologies, is you're able to get this kind of wide berth of styles and aesthetics and subject and point of view. And so I think there's absolutely incredible benefits to putting out an anthology that has such a wide range of styles and tones. So yeah, I think those comments are absolutely fair.
Right. Now, I mentioned right before we leave this book, I mentioned at the beginning when we first started to discuss the anthology that it's made up of 12 contributions and an extra at the end. And at the very end of this volume, there is a part of a story, and it's called Bergheim. And it's written by Kate Leth and Jeremy Lambert with art by Afua Richardson. And this is only the first part of a story that I think we could find in its complete form, as we see on the last page. It says, read the rest as an animated motion book exclusive on the free Attack on Titan manga app. And it gives you a URL to go to, a place at kodanshacomics.com where you can find this free app. Now, this book came out in September. I don't know did you check out that website, that page?
I haven't, and I will tell you why. As much as I really like Afua Richardson, I like I think obviously digital work she's doing in that with these very thick and visible brushstrokes. I think it's a really good looking little tease for this motion comic. But I got to tell you, nothing turns me off more than the idea of a motion comic. There are a few things in this world I hate as much as I hate motion comics.
Okay.
Well,
the reason I wanted to point this out is, whether someone likes motion comics or not, you're definitely of the latter variety. It gives a URL, and this book came out in September, right before we recorded, and here we are at the end of November. I went to that page and looked to see what I could find, but they still have that the app is to come. It hasn't been released yet. So, this is a tease that is continuing to be a tease. So if you get Attack on Titan Anthology, you read this last, at least partial story, and then want to find out what happens with the rest of it, Bergheim, and you go to that page on kodansha.com, at least as of the end of November, close to the end of November, the app is still not available. So, if you're a fan of motion comics, you're not going to be able to see this. If you're not a fan of motion comics like Shea, you probably wouldn't check this out anyhow. So just know that going in. So, Shea, we started this month's manga episode by discussing A Distant Neighborhood, the complete edition by Jiro Taniguchi, and then we wrapped up with Kodansha's Attack on Titan Anthology. So there was a lot for us to discuss in November.
Yep, and I think pretty good books.
Yes, very good books. We recommend them. In fact, we recommend everything that we discuss on the show, because otherwise we wouldn't be discussing them. So there you go. Some things to think about for the gift-giving season. And if you want to find great books like this, you definitely have to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com, you'll find great deals on manga and other kinds of comics. And after you do get your books there, get in touch with us and let me and Shea know the kind of things that you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And you can also get a hold of us via email. Both of us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me specifically at Shea@comicsalternative.com, and Derek, if they want to get a hold of you specifically, where can they go?
At Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media like Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Spotify. And if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, and we do appreciate it when you contact us and reach out and let us know what you think about the show.
Yeah, we've even read some some letters from listeners on the air.
Yeah, we like to do that. So definitely send us the letters, and we will read them and share them with everyone else. Until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later.